Samuel had already decided that royal palaces were the worst possible places to finish a contract. Not because they were dangerous. Dangerous places made sense to him. Asteroid mines, malfunctioning freighters, orbital repair yards where gravity turned on and off whenever the station computer felt moody. Those environments followed logical rules. A palace, however, followed no rules at all. For example, Samuel was currently walking through a corridor the size of a small canyon while six armored guards silently watched him as if he might suddenly dismantle the building with a screwdriver. He adjusted the strap of the heavy toolkit hanging from his shoulder and kept walking. The corridor walls were made of pale, crystalline stone that softly glowed with internal energy currents. Samuel had repaired those currents 3 weeks earlier, when the palace lights began flickering during an important diplomatic banquet. The repair had taken him 40 minutes. The argument between three ambassadors about who was responsible for the flickering had lasted 6 hours. Samuel still wasn't sure why they blamed each other instead of the wiring. His boots echoed across the smooth floor as he approached the exit hall. The massive doors ahead opened onto the palace landing platforms, where his shuttle waited patiently, probably wondering why humans took so long to leave places. Samuel felt lighter with every step. 6 months. 6 months inside the floating royal palace of Queen Thora. 6 months repairing shield grids, gravity stabilizers, atmospheric regulators, and one extremely confused coffee machine that had attempted to brew soup. He was proud of the soup machine repair. It had fought him. Behind him, palace life continued as usual. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying glowing data tablets. Scientists argued about quantum harmonics near a holographic star map. Somewhere far above, royal advisors were probably discussing important matters such as war, diplomacy, or why the palace AI insisted on greeting everyone with the phrase, "Please remain calm, nothing is on fire today." Samuel had tried to reprogram that greeting. The AI refused. He reached the final hallway leading toward the departure platform and slowed slightly. The enormous arched windows along the wall revealed the endless ocean below the floating palace. Silver waves reflected the sunlight of Thora Prime's pale blue star. Beautiful view, still not worth staying. Samuel shifted his toolbox again and muttered to himself. Repair the shield grid, they said. Quick palace job, they said. 6 weeks maximum. He had believed them. 6 weeks had quietly become 6 months, mostly because every time he fixed one system, the palace discovered 3 more systems that needed urgent human engineering intuition. Apparently, alien engineers preferred to solve problems by debating them for 3 days first. Samuel preferred tools. He reached the massive doors at the end of the hall. Beyond them lay the landing platforms, the waiting shuttle, and the comforting knowledge that no one in space expected him to attend formal banquets. He placed a hand on the door control panel. The doors slid open with a low mechanical hum. Fresh air drifted in from outside. The distant roar of shuttle engines echoed across the platforms. Samuel stepped forward. Freedom. He took exactly 3 steps before a voice behind him shattered the quiet. Don't go! Samuel stopped so suddenly the toolbox nearly swung into his knee. The voice was small but sharp with desperation, echoing across the enormous corridor. He turned slowly. A small figure was running toward him. Princess Nira. Samuel recognized her immediately. Everyone in the palace recognized her. The young daughter of Queen Thora, with silver hair and long, elegant ears that curved slightly backward like delicate blades. She was running far too fast for someone her size. Samuel blinked in confusion. He had spoken to the princess before, briefly, politely, but she had never answered him. In fact, she had not answered anyone for months. The entire palace knew the reason. Since the death of the king during the Frontier War, the princess had fallen completely silent. No words, no laughter, not even whispers. Samuel opened his mouth, unsure what to say. Princess Nira reached him and grabbed the sleeve of his coat with both hands. Her breathing was uneven from running. Her eyes were wide and bright with something between panic and determination. Don't go, she repeated. Samuel stared at her. Then he slowly glanced down the corridor. The palace had frozen. Servants stood perfectly still. 2 guards stared at the princess as if gravity had suddenly reversed. A royal scientist dropped a glowing tablet that clattered loudly across the floor. Samuel looked back at Nira. Well, he said quietly, scratching the back of his neck. This is unexpected. Samuel had repaired many complicated systems in his life. He had repaired collapsed mining drones drifting through asteroid fields. He had repaired a freighter reactor while the captain screamed about insurance claims. Once, he had even repaired a station door that had decided to open only for people who sang to it. But he had never repaired a situation like this. Princess Nira still clung to his sleeve. Not politely, not gently. She held it with the absolute determination of someone who had decided that physics itself would have to negotiate if it wanted Samuel to leave. Samuel slowly looked down at her hands, gripping the fabric of his coat. Well, he said carefully, this might be the strongest security system in the palace. Nira didn't laugh, but her grip tightened. Behind them, the enormous corridor remained frozen. Servants stood motionless. Guards stared like statues carved from very confused metal. One elderly advisor leaned toward another and whispered something that sounded suspiciously like, "Did she just speak?" The whisper spread like a chain reaction. "She spoke. The princess spoke. I heard it too. Someone inform—" The whisper died instantly as a new presence entered the corridor. Queen Thora. She moved through the hallway with quiet authority, her long silver armor reflecting the soft, crystalline lights of the palace walls. Even without guards announcing her arrival, everyone stepped aside instinctively. Samuel had seen the queen many times during his contract, but usually from a comfortable distance while holding tools or pretending to adjust equipment. Up close, she was impressive. Tall, calm, and composed, with long, elegant ears like her daughter's, though sharper at the tips. Her expression was controlled, but Samuel noticed something fragile hidden beneath the calm surface. The queen stopped several meters away. Her gaze moved first to Samuel, then to the princess. Then to the princess holding Samuel like an extremely determined luggage tag. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, the queen said quietly, "Nira." The princess looked up at her mother, but did not release Samuel. Samuel cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he said politely, raising his free hand in a small wave, because he wasn't sure if bowing would cause the princess to lose her grip and fall over. The queen's attention shifted briefly toward him. Samuel felt the full weight of royal observation. It was similar to being examined by a very intelligent security scanner. "Engineer Samuel," the queen said calmly. He nodded. "Yes, that's me. Still the same engineer who fixed your gravity stabilizer. I promise I didn't break it again." No one laughed. Samuel sighed internally. He had been hoping humor might help. Queen Thora knelt slowly in front of her daughter, her armor making a soft metallic sound as it touched the polished floor. "Nira," she repeated gently. The princess hesitated. Samuel could feel the tension in her hands. The palace seemed to hold its breath. Then the princess spoke again. "He can't leave." The sentence was quiet but perfectly clear. A palace guard somewhere behind Samuel made a noise that sounded like someone forgetting how lungs worked. Samuel slowly looked toward the ceiling. "Well," he muttered softly, "that complicates my travel plans." Queen Thora did not react immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on her daughter, searching her face as if trying to confirm something impossible. "Nira," the queen said carefully, "why do you say this?" The princess looked at Samuel briefly, then back at her mother. "He listens." The corridor remained silent. Samuel blinked. "That's surprisingly rare feedback for an engineer," he said quietly. One of the royal scientists in the background coughed to hide a laugh. Queen Thora's expression shifted slightly, just enough that Samuel noticed the emotion behind it. Months. Samuel remembered the palace rumors. The princess had not spoken for months, not since the king's death in the frontier war. Every healer, counselor, and royal specialist had tried to help her. None had succeeded, and yet she had just shouted across the palace for a slightly confused human engineer carrying a toolbox. Samuel looked down at Nira again. "You know," he said gently, "most people ask engineers to stay because something is broken." Nira shook her head. "You can't go." Samuel rubbed his face with his free hand. "Right." He glanced toward the open palace doors where his shuttle waited peacefully on the landing platform. So close. He looked back at the queen. "Well," he said carefully, "I didn't expect my departure to become a diplomatic situation." Queen Thora slowly stood again. Her posture remained regal, but the tension in her eyes had changed. Hope had appeared there. Careful, cautious hope. "Engineer Samuel," she said quietly, "perhaps you should postpone your departure." Samuel stared at her. Then he looked at Nira, then at the shuttle outside, then back at the Queen. He sighed. "Your Majesty," he said, "I had planned a very relaxing evening involving space travel and absolutely no royal responsibilities." Nira tugged his sleeve again. Samuel looked down at her. She stared back with the calm certainty only children seem capable of. Samuel sighed again. "Well," he said, "I suppose the shuttle can wait a little longer." The palace corridor slowly returned to life, though no one seemed completely sure how to behave after witnessing the impossible. Servants resumed walking, but several of them kept glancing back at the princess as if worried she might suddenly start giving speeches. A pair of royal scientists whispered urgently into their tablets, probably sending messages that read something like, "Update, miracle detected, cause appears to be human engineer with toolbox." Samuel stood in the middle of the corridor, trying very hard to look like someone who had planned this entire situation. Princess Nira still held his sleeve, not quite as tightly now, but clearly with the intention of preventing any sudden escape attempts. Samuel glanced down at her. "You know," he said quietly, "this is the first time someone has physically prevented me from finishing a contract." Nira looked up at him. "You were leaving?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, that was the original plan." Behind them, Queen Thora observed the scene carefully. Her posture remained composed, but Samuel noticed she had dismissed the guards with a subtle gesture. The corridor gradually emptied until only a few distant attendants remained at the far end. The Queen approached. Samuel straightened slightly, suddenly aware that standing in front of a galactic monarch while being held hostage by her daughter was not something his engineering training had prepared him for. Queen Thora stopped a few steps away. "Engineer Samuel," she said calmly, "you appear to have formed a connection with my daughter." Samuel scratched his neck. "That sounds much more professional than the situation actually is." Nira tugged his sleeve again. Samuel raised a finger. "See, this is what I mean." The Queen almost smiled. "Almost. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere quieter," she said. Samuel glanced toward the open palace doors where the landing platform and his shuttle waited like a disappointed taxi driver. Then he looked at Nira, then at the Queen, then back at the shuttle. "Well," he muttered, "this is how engineers accidentally become part of royal politics." Nira immediately began pulling him toward the interior of the palace. Samuel stumbled slightly. "Ah," he said, "I see we've skipped the discussion phase." They moved deeper into the palace, eventually entering a large chamber filled with tall, transparent walls that displayed drifting holographic stars. Samuel recognized the room. It was one of the palace observation halls where the royal family sometimes studied nearby systems. Nira finally released his sleeve. Samuel flexed his arm. "I'm going to need a new contract clause about unexpected princess-related detainment." Nira ignored the comment and sat down on a low platform near the window. Queen Thora remained standing. Samuel awkwardly set his toolbox on the floor and leaned against it. For a moment, no one spoke. Outside the window, a fleet of small patrol ships drifted slowly through the sky like silent silver fish. Finally, the Queen said, "My daughter has not spoken in many months." Samuel nodded quietly. "I heard. She has refused to speak to advisors, teachers, or healers." Samuel glanced at Nira. Nira stared at the stars. Queen Thora continued softly, "Even with me." The room became very quiet. Samuel shifted his weight slightly. "Well," he said carefully, "for what it's worth, she hasn't been talking much to me either." Nira turned her head and looked at him. Samuel raised both hands defensively. "Hey, I'm just saying. I mostly talk about broken wiring." The princess considered this. Then she said, "You listen." Samuel blinked. "That's surprisingly rare praise in my profession." The Queen studied him. "What did you speak about with her?" Samuel thought for a moment. "Mostly tools." "Tools?" "Yes." Queen Thora tilted her head slightly. Samuel shrugged. "I showed her how a plasma spanner works. Then I explained why engineers always carry extra magnetic bolts. Then she asked why humans build machines that explode. That is a reasonable question, the Queen said. Samuel nodded seriously. We ask ourselves that all the time. Nira swung her legs slowly while watching the stars. Ships explode because humans test them too fast, she said. Samuel looked impressed. That is alarmingly accurate. The Queen observed the two of them in silence. Then she asked, "And you believe you can continue helping her?" Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. Well, technically I'm not helping her. I'm just fixing random palace equipment while she supervises. Nira nodded proudly. I supervise, Samuel pointed at her. Very strict supervisor. The princess leaned forward slightly. You can't go. Samuel sighed softly. He looked toward the enormous star field outside, then at the Queen, then back at the princess. You know, he said slowly, I had a very peaceful plan for tonight. Nira waited. Samuel spread his hands. Step 1, leave palace. Nira frowned. Step 2, fly shuttle. Nira crossed her arms. Step 3, eat dinner that does not involve royal protocol. Nira remained silent for a moment. Then she said calmly, You can eat dinner here. Samuel stared at her. The Queen covered her mouth for a moment, hiding what might have been the first genuine smile she had shown in months. Samuel sighed dramatically. Well, he said, that's a surprisingly strong counter-argument. Samuel discovered very quickly that postponing his departure by a little while was a dangerous phrase inside a royal palace. A little while apparently meant several hours, 2 meetings with confused palace officials, and one very serious discussion with the palace AI about why the engineer who was scheduled to leave had not left. Samuel was currently sitting on the floor of an enormous maintenance chamber beneath the palace. Princess Nira sat beside him. Her legs swung slowly over the edge of a metal platform while she watched him dismantle a glowing panel from the wall. Samuel carefully pulled out a cluster of shimmering cables and frowned. Interesting, he muttered. Nira leaned closer. What is it? Samuel pointed at the cables. This, he said, is what happens when someone tries to repair a quantum stabilizer using optimism instead of tools. Nira tilted her head. Optimism? Samuel nodded. Yes, very dangerous engineering method. He tapped one of the cables gently with a screwdriver. The cable sparked blue for a moment. Nira's eyes widened. Samuel smiled. See? That wire believes in itself too much. Nira giggled. The sound echoed through the huge maintenance chamber. Samuel paused. He had heard the princess laugh earlier in the observation hall, but here the sound felt different, lighter, freer. He pretended not to notice. Instead, he continued adjusting the cables. Hold this, he said, handing her a small magnetic clamp. Nira grabbed it carefully. Samuel worked quickly, tightening connectors and replacing a small energy relay that looked like it had been installed during the early days of the Empire. After a few seconds, the panel hummed smoothly. Samuel leaned back. There we go. The entire wall brightened slightly as the stabilizer returned to full power. Nira clapped once. Samuel gave a small bow from the floor. Thank you, Supervisor. Nira held the magnetic clamp like an official royal instrument. You fixed it. Samuel shrugged. That's the job. He began gathering his tools. You know, he added, most people don't enjoy watching someone repair palace wiring. Nira thought for a moment. I do. Samuel pointed toward the glowing panel. Careful. If you watch long enough, you might become an engineer. Nira looked horrified. Is that bad? Samuel placed a hand dramatically on his chest. Extremely. She laughed again. A quiet sound came from the entrance of the chamber. Samuel looked up. Queen Thora stood in the doorway. She had arrived silently, her tall figure framed by the soft light of the corridor behind her. Samuel quickly wiped his hands on a cloth and stood. Your Majesty, he said. The Queen stepped into the chamber slowly. Her gaze moved first to the repaired stabilizer, then to the scattered tools, then finally to her daughter. Nira was still smiling. The Queen's expression softened slightly. Samuel leaned against the wall casually. Just routine palace repair, he said. Nothing exploded. That is reassuring, Thora replied. She walked closer. Nira jumped off the platform and ran to her mother. Samuel fixed the stabilizer. Samuel raised a finger. With excellent supervision. Nira nodded proudly. Queen Thora studied the engineer quietly. I was informed, she said, that several palace departments are now requesting your assistance. Samuel groaned softly. That was fast. The shield technicians wish to consult you. Of course they do. The Energy Council would like your opinion. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. And the palace kitchen has submitted a repair request regarding a device that produces something called burning noodles. Samuel blinked. I specifically warned them about the thermal settings. The Queen tilted her head. You repaired the kitchen as well? Samuel sighed. I tried. Nira tugged his sleeve again. You have to stay. Samuel looked down at her. Well, he said slowly, right now I'm staying because someone refuses to release my coat. Nira held the sleeve tighter. Queen Thora watched them both. For a moment the room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the stabilizer. You plan to leave today, the Queen said. Samuel nodded. That was the original mission. And now? Samuel glanced around the chamber. The glowing walls, the scattered tools, the small princess standing beside him like a determined assistant. He scratched the back of his neck. Well, he admitted, my shuttle is still waiting. Nira immediately shook her head. No. Samuel smiled slightly. I noticed that. Queen Thora folded her hands behind her back. You may remain as long as you wish, she said calmly. Samuel looked surprised. That's a dangerous offer. How so? Because engineers are very good at staying where the problems are. Nira pointed toward the palace ceiling. There are many problems. Samuel sighed. Yes, he said, glancing upward. I'm starting to realize that. Samuel had once believed that starship engines were the most complicated systems in the galaxy. After 3 days of remaining inside the royal palace of Thora, he had officially changed his opinion. Royal palaces were far more complicated, not because of the machines. The machines were actually quite reasonable. Shield generators hummed politely. Energy conduits behaved predictably. Even the palace gravity stabilizer had begun cooperating after Samuel replaced a few stubborn components. The real complication was the people, or more specifically, the palace staff, who had now discovered that the human engineer had apparently become a permanent feature of the building. Samuel stepped into the central corridor carrying his toolbox and immediately regretted leaving the maintenance chambers. 3 officials spotted him at the same time. They rushed toward him like scientists discovering a rare cosmic event. Engineer Samuel. He froze. Yes? The first official held up a glowing tablet. The atmospheric circulation system in the eastern wing is making a noise that suggests minor instability. The second official leaned forward eagerly. The communications array occasionally translates diplomatic messages into poetry. Samuel blinked. That might not be a technical malfunction. The third official spoke with dramatic urgency. And the Royal Aquarium filtration system has begun producing bubbles shaped like hexagons. Samuel slowly raised a hand. One problem at a time, he said. Behind him, Princess Nira stepped into the corridor. The officials immediately straightened like startled statues. Samuel pointed at them. See? This is why engineers avoid royal corridors. Nira walked up beside him and folded her arms with impressive seriousness. You should fix the air system first. Samuel looked down at her. Ah, the supervisor has spoken. One of the officials whispered to another. The princess is speaking again. The whisper spread quickly. Samuel rubbed his face. Please don't turn this into a palace-wide celebration every time she talks. Nira ignored him. The air system, she repeated. Samuel sighed. Yes, supervisor. They walked together through the palace toward the eastern wing. The corridors were bright with soft white light reflecting from the crystal walls. Outside the massive windows, sleek patrol ships moved silently across the sky of Thora Prime. Samuel pushed open the maintenance door of the eastern ventilation chamber. Warm air flowed through dozens of tall silver ducts arranged like enormous metallic trees. Samuel set his toolbox on the floor. All right, he said, looking up at the ducts. Which one of you is complaining? Nira climbed onto a nearby equipment crate to watch. Samuel opened a panel and listened carefully. A faint vibration echoed through the system. He frowned. That's not instability. Nira leaned forward. What is it? Samuel tapped the panel twice. The vibration changed pitch. Samuel groaned. Oh, no. Nira tilted her head. Oh, no, what? Samuel pointed upward. There's something inside the ventilation pipe. Nira's eyes widened. Something alive? Samuel shrugged. In a palace this large, the answer is usually yes. He grabbed a scanning device from his toolbox and aimed it into the duct. The scanner beeped. Samuel stared at the screen. Then he laughed. Nira blinked. What is it? Samuel held up the scanner. It's a maintenance drone. A drone? Yes. Why is it stuck? Samuel crossed his arms. Because someone programmed it to clean the ventilation system without explaining that ducts occasionally narrow. Nira giggled. Samuel grabbed a small remote device and activated it. Inside the duct, something bumped loudly. A tiny spherical drone rolled out of the pipe and dropped into Samuel's hands. Its sensors blinked apologetically. Samuel looked at it. You had one job. The drone beeped weakly. Nira clapped. Samuel placed the drone on the floor. There, he said. Ventilation system saved. Nira smiled proudly. You fixed it. Samuel pointed at her. With excellent supervision. A quiet voice spoke from the doorway. You seem very busy. Samuel turned. Queen Thora stood there again, observing the scene calmly. Samuel lifted the small drone. Your Majesty, as he said, I found the criminal responsible for the ventilation problem. The drone beeped again. The Queen stepped closer. Her eyes moved between Samuel and her daughter. Nira looked happier than Samuel had ever seen her. You solved it quickly, Thora said. Samuel shrugged. It's easier when the problem is small and round. Nira tugged his sleeve again. You should stay. Samuel sighed dramatically. You say that every hour. Nira nodded. Yes. Samuel looked toward the open window where the distant stars glimmered above the planet. Then he looked back at the princess, then at the Queen. Well, he said slowly, I suppose the palace still has a few systems that might explode if I leave. Nira smiled. Samuel raised a finger. And by explode, I mean emotionally. Queen Thora almost laughed. Samuel noticed. And for the first time since arriving at the palace, he began to suspect that the princess might not be the only one who needed him to stay. Samuel had begun to notice a pattern in palace life. Every morning he woke up fully intending to leave. Every afternoon something broke. Every evening Princess Nira reminded him that leaving was clearly a terrible idea. It was a very efficient system. On the fourth morning of his temporary delay, Samuel stood on a balcony overlooking the floating city beneath the palace. His shuttle still waited on the landing platform several levels below, quietly accumulating dust and probably wondering why its pilot had abandoned it for palace wiring. Samuel held a cup of royal coffee and stared at the horizon. The coffee machine had tried to attack him yesterday. He had fixed it, mostly. Behind him, the palace doors slid open. Nira walked onto the balcony carrying something in both hands. Samuel glanced down. Please tell me that is not another broken machine? Nira shook her head and held it up proudly. It was a small metal sphere with two glowing lenses. Samuel blinked. Is that the maintenance drone from yesterday? Nira nodded. You repaired it. Samuel sighed. Yes, unfortunately. The drone beeped cheerfully. Samuel pointed at it. This one got stuck in the ventilation system. Nira placed the drone on the balcony railing. The small machine rolled slightly and stabilized itself with tiny magnetic feet. Samuel leaned against the railing. You know, he said, I once repaired a mining robot that tried to escape into space. Nira's eyes widened. Why? Samuel shrugged. It discovered freedom. The drone beeped again, as if agreeing with the concept. Nira giggled. Samuel sipped his coffee. Careful, he warned the drone. If you escape the palace, they'll probably promote you to chief engineer. The drone rotated its lenses toward him. Nira pointed at the horizon. You are going to leave. Samuel followed her gaze. Far away, starships moved slowly through the sky lanes above the planet. Yeah, he said quietly. That was the plan. Nira looked at him seriously. You help. Samuel raised an eyebrow. I mostly repair broken machines. Nira shook her head. You help people. Samuel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Before he could answer, the balcony doors opened once more. Queen Thora stepped outside. She wore a lighter ceremonial uniform today, though her presence still carried the calm gravity of someone used to commanding fleets. Samuel raised his coffee in greeting. "Good morning, Your Majesty." The Queen looked at the drone sitting on the railing. "I see the maintenance drone has been promoted to balcony security." Samuel pointed at Nira. "She assigned it." Nira nodded proudly. The drone beeped. Queen Thora approached the railing. For a moment, the three of them stood together looking over the floating city. The wind moved gently through the Queen's silver hair. Samuel noticed she seemed more relaxed than during their first meetings. "Engineer Samuel," she said quietly. "Yes?" "You originally came here to repair the palace shield network." Samuel nodded. "Correct. That task was completed weeks ago." Samuel took another sip of coffee. "Technically, yes. Yet you remain." Samuel looked at Nira. Nira looked back. Then he shrugged. "Well," he said carefully, "the palace appears to be a very fragile ecosystem." Queen Thora tilted her head slightly. "How so?" Samuel gestured toward Nira. "If I leave, the supervisor might file a complaint." Nira crossed her arms. "Yes." The Queen watched the exchange silently. Then she asked softly, "Do you regret staying?" Samuel leaned against the railing. The city lights below shimmered across the ocean surface far beneath the floating palace. He thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he admitted. The Queen seemed to relax slightly. Nira smiled. Samuel raised a finger. "However," he added, "I do regret teaching the palace kitchen how to make human noodles." Queen Thora blinked. The cook seemed very enthusiastic. Samuel nodded slowly. "That's the problem." Nira laughed. The small maintenance drone beeped excitedly and spun in a tiny circle. Samuel pointed at it. "See? Even the machines are encouraging this chaos." The Queen looked between them again. Then she said quietly, "Sometimes the smallest changes reshape entire worlds." Samuel scratched his neck. "Your Majesty," he said, "I only replaced a few wires." Nira tugged his sleeve. "You stay." Samuel sighed again. "You know," he said, "for someone who didn't speak for months, you're becoming very persuasive." Nira smiled. Samuel looked at the Queen. The Queen looked back at him. For a moment the balcony was quiet except for the distant sound of ships moving through the sky. Samuel finally exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "I suppose the palace still has a few systems that need supervision." Nira nodded confidently. "Yes." Samuel glanced down at the drone. "You too," he added. The drone beeped in agreement. Samuel finally stood on the landing platform again. It had taken him 12 days to return to the exact place where he had originally planned to leave the palace. 12 very long, very strange days. His shuttle still waited where he had parked it, its silver hull reflecting the soft light of Thora Prime's blue sun. A thin layer of dust covered the landing struts, as if the ship had begun quietly judging him for abandoning it. Samuel stood beside his toolbox and looked at it thoughtfully. "You waited," he muttered. The shuttle did not reply, though its navigation lights blinked with patient annoyance. Behind him, the enormous palace doors stood open. The floating city stretched across the horizon, glowing softly above the endless silver ocean. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," he said quietly to himself, "time to finish what I started." He picked up his toolbox and stepped toward the shuttle ramp. "Samuel!" The voice echoed across the platform. Samuel closed his eyes slowly. Then he turned around. Princess Nira ran across the platform toward him, her silver hair moving wildly behind her. Samuel sighed. "I had a feeling this might happen." Nira stopped in front of him, slightly out of breath but smiling. "You didn't say goodbye." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "I thought it might be easier that way." Nira crossed her arms. "It wasn't." Samuel looked down at her. 12 days ago she had barely spoken. Now she spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had rediscovered her voice and decided to use it often. Behind her, Queen Thora walked onto the landing platform. She moved slowly, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew the outcome of a conversation. Samuel set his toolbox down. "Your Majesty," the Queen nodded gently. "Engineer Samuel." For a moment none of them spoke. The wind moved softly across the platform, carrying the distant sound of ships traveling through the upper atmosphere. Samuel glanced toward his shuttle again, then back at them. Well, he said carefully, I suppose this is the part where I thank you for the unusual contract extension. Nira grabbed his sleeve. Samuel looked down at her hand. Of course, he added. Some people are very determined negotiators. Nira ignored the comment. You can't leave. Samuel exhaled slowly. You've said that before. Yes. Samuel gestured toward the shuttle. But my ship is right there. Nira thought for a moment. Then she pointed at the palace behind them. But we are here. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it. Then he looked at Queen Thora. You know, he said quietly, she's getting very good at winning arguments. The Queen's expression softened slightly. Yes, she said. Samuel leaned against the railing of the platform. 12 days. 12 days of repairing systems, arguing with palace engineers, teaching Nira how to use basic tools, and discovering that the royal kitchen could produce 17 different versions of something they called human noodles. Some of them had been concerning, but during those 12 days, something else had changed too. The palace corridors were louder now, not with political arguments or military reports, with laughter, with conversation, with a young princess who had slowly stepped out of the silence that had surrounded her since the war. Samuel looked down at Nira. She was watching him carefully, waiting. He sighed softly. You know, he said, when I first arrived here, I planned to stay 6 weeks. Nira nodded. Samuel continued. Then the shield generator broke. Nira nodded again. Then the gravity stabilizer. Yes. Then the ventilation drones. Nira smiled slightly. Samuel spread his hands. And now the palace seems strangely functional. Nira tilted her head. That means you can stay. Samuel laughed quietly. That is a very dangerous interpretation of engineering success. Queen Thora stepped closer. Samuel, she said softly. He looked at her. You once said engineers stay where the problems are. Samuel nodded slowly. I did say that. The Queen gestured gently toward the palace behind them. Then perhaps you should remain. Samuel looked at the enormous floating palace, the glowing towers, the sky lanes filled with ships, the strange, chaotic place that had somehow become familiar. Then he looked at Nira. She was still holding his sleeve, just like the first day. Samuel sighed again. Well, he said thoughtfully, technically speaking, Nira waited. There is still one system here that requires constant supervision. Nira smiled. Which one? Samuel pointed at her. The supervisor. Nira laughed. The sound echoed across the landing platform and drifted out over the endless ocean. Queen Thora closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to a sound she had feared she might never hear again. Samuel picked up his toolbox. Then he turned away from the shuttle. The navigation lights blinked once behind him, possibly in disappointment. Samuel looked back briefly. Sorry, he told the ship. Then he walked toward the palace. Nira walked beside him. Queen Thora followed quietly. And somewhere high above the floating palace, the stars continued their silent journey across the sky while a human engineer accidentally discovered that sometimes the most important repairs were not made with tools at all.